All right, today we're going to take a look at chapter 12 on advertising. And with this, it really, when we start getting into advertising and start to think about advertising, there's a lot of different parts to the advertising piece where you can actually find yourself working into. And with that, just know that when we start getting into advertising, we're dealing with a larger group. That's why we get into agency work with it. You're also going to see that there's a lot of stuff related to advertising that also goes back to dealing with posters and dealing with book covers as well. So we're going to grasp the purpose of advertising, become more aware of who actually creates advertising, understanding the advertising design process. Is that we're going to go through with this. Really continue to push the idea that we have this story that we're telling. What is it that we're working with it? As we start working with advertising, the other thing is we're actually going through and we're building. So we talk about story building. We want to go ahead and as we start to create stuff, we know that something's coming after it. We know something came before it. So how ultimately are those going to work with each other to go ahead and continue to build that story? And then get into learning really how do we go about designing ads? What are those steps? What is that process that we go through to get to ultimately what we end up putting on the paper, and how does that ultimately then tell that story that we've talked about, the narrative. We're always pushing that narrative. Anytime you're designing something, you have the story that's part of it. I chose these colors because it feels like a nice sunrise in the Florida Keys, kind of like it is outside today. So with that, we start to think about what is it that we're actually going to go in and work with. The other thing is what ultimately goes in and constitutes an advertising campaign. So what are the pieces that we're going to look at that go into the campaign? And then we'll ultimately get into practicing responsible advertising and becoming proactive as we go through and work with it. So right now we have a free market system. So with that, what we're trying to do is we're trying to advertise and promote one brand over something else. So as we go through and start to work with that, what is it that we can do to ultimately make our brand be seen? What can we do to make our brand seem as though it is better than the competitor? There are products out there that are all manufactured in the exact same facility. They're put into 55-gallon drums, they're shipped out to the various packaging places, and then all of a sudden you run through, and a lot of times even there's a single corporation that will package everything, same product, however it's going into different bottles with different looks, being sold for different prices, being sold in different stores, yet what's inside of it is all the same. So as we start to think about that, what is it that you're able to do, or what can you do to make people ultimately want to choose your product? The other thing we can go through and talk about are social issues. So as we go through and start thinking about what is it we want to make people aware of. I want to go in and begin to expose people to things. Other times we go through and start looking at actions. We want you to do something. So we go through and we start looking at charitable organizations, nonprofits. What is it that we can get you to go in and begin to do? As you start to look at charitable, maybe it's a situation where they push the fact, you can donate this stuff and save money on your taxes. Or it's the Red Cross talking about, donate blood and we'll give you a $5 Amazon gift card.
Actually, 20 would more than
20? You want 20? Well, maybe they'll give you 20 then.
They wouldn't want to give you anything that can actually be used. Yeah, they're like, here's a lanyard. You're never going to use it.
Maybe. With it, a lot of times, of course, they do t-shirts. So what is it that's there? And as you start to think about the stuff as well, though, start to think about what is it that would get you to come in there. So you start looking at products, start thinking about products. You start to advertise and do the designs for it. And you start working for organizations and you're working on advertising design. Don't be afraid to sit there and still think about what are things that you think of when you do that, or when that product is mentioned. Is that in line with what the product does, or does that counteract what the product does? So we go through and we start looking at things. Most of our competing brands are of equal quality and have those equivalent defining features. So when we really start to think about it, they're on par with each other. So one isn't better than the other based upon the factor of what ingredients are inside of there. But each of you might have your favorite candy bar. Why do you choose that candy bar?
Because we like the taste of it.
Because you like the taste of it. But if you go through and start to think about what's in certain things, you'll find multiple ones out there that have chocolate, nougat, caramel, and peanuts. But ultimately, what do you go through and choose? I mean, there's a lot of different ones out there. So as we start to think about that, why are you choosing what's there? So as we go through and begin to build these things, since we're seeing them, that they're built with equal quality ingredients, what is it that distinguishes us to choose one over the other? The what? Advertising. So it's how it's actually presented to us. I mean, if we go in there and we start looking at things, if we look at just the appearance of items, if I take a Hershey bar and I melt it into a big pile of chocolate and let it harden back up and I set it on a plate, or I give you one that's wrapped in a package sitting there, which one are you going to choose to eat? Not sure? Are you going to eat a puddle of chocolate or are you going to eat a bar of chocolate?
Bar of chocolate more than a puddle.
Right. So,
Puddle if you don't have something to dip it.
so in the sense that we have parity on this, that they're both the same Hershey bar. One's melted into a puddle and then hardens back up, so it's this like disc of chocolate versus the regular Hershey bar. You're going to choose the regular Hershey bar just because of the appearance of that. So we go through and start to think about that's what the goal of us working with this is we're working in advertising to promote one brand over the other, to do something to say this one brand is better than that other brand. In the case of the chocolate bar that's in a disc that's been melted versus the one that's nice and neat in a bar that we can snap into little pieces is all about appearance. So as you start to think about what it is you're building, what you're putting onto that package, what you're putting into that advertisement, you have to start to think about what are you going to be saying with it. Choices in colors. Are we choosing silver foil versus gold foil? Are we going in and playing with a color that works with the chocolate? Are we playing something that goes in and makes us think of something else? So as we go through and start to work with it, what is it that's going to go through and ultimately persuade you to go in and select a certain item?
If it's like, if it, how am I gonna say this? Yeah, if it like, Frank, I just lost my answer. But it's like connecting like your own like interest and all that.
Your own interests, your own experiences. So as you go through and you start to work from, any design element, I always push people to go in and expose themselves to certain things. So we start looking at materials, we start looking at products, we start looking at advertising. Don't be afraid to go through and start to walk through stores. Don't be afraid to, when we talk about walking through stores, walking through grocery stores and looking at the name brands that you recognize, the difference between the name brands and the ones that are the off brands on the shelf. Look at the ones that's in one section, you get into the organic foods. What do they do in the organic ones that's different from the regular pages? How are we going in and dealing with items that are vegan, gluten-free, vegetarian options? How do those look different than the main ones?
They usually have a certain box design.
They can have a different box design.
Or they pitch the advertisement that they're organic or they're vegan, something like that, or meat-free, usually it's meat-free.
Right.
Meat-free.
So you'll find things on there where they put it into the name of the product. The other thing with it too is starting to understand the symbols for the various items. Some gluten-free in that we have the circle with GF in it. So as we go through and we start to choose those, what exactly are we going to be seeing inside of them? as we go in and we start to push in. Remember, when we talk about an advertisement, so an advertisement is really just a specific message that's constructed to inform, persuade, promote, provoke, or motivate people on behalf of a brand, entity, or cause. So when we go through and we start to think about it, that's an ad. We've seen them all of our lives. They've influenced us all of our lives. You know, when you're a kid and you're sitting there watching cartoons, there's a reason why they put all the sugary cereal in those advertisements on the screen.
And then commercials about action figures as well.
Right. They're there to get you to want to go and get something. In that case, you know, they're going towards the emotional side. Oh, I gotta have that. Gotta have
And
that.
you don't end up watching movies. 2-hour commercial.
Right. So as we start to think about what's happening with that, as we get the advertisement, we need to start to think about what is effective advertising. So when we go through and start to get it, what do we want to have? If we go through and we create an advertisement, what do we want to have happen to it? What are some ideas? What's that? So as we start to pull those up, we obviously want people to begin to talk about the stuff. So when we start thinking about ads, first off, we want people to participate and purchase a product. We want them to actually have conversations with other people. We want to start looking at different media channels. So we start to deal with that communication, where do we want this to show up at? Right now in the age of social media, if I put an advertisement out there and you see it and you like it, I want you to share it. I want you to put it on your Instagram pages, your Facebook pages, you know, to Snapchat about it. I want you to push the stuff through there. So I want to see that move on there. I want to go through and we want to start to look at what are we doing with the product? How is this product going to benefit you? On your Snickers bar, it's just, you're not going to be hangry anymore. Your life's going to be so much better after you have a Snickers bar. So what are we doing with that? What are these things that we can provide, the ideas that we're throwing at people that's actually going to go in and actually benefit you? Because remember, if we go through and we see something as a benefit to us, it's doing more than just simply getting us to go in and buy a product or sell a product to you. So I'm not just selling you something. It's not just a thing, it's a feeling that you're going to get from it. So you go through and start to look at why do you purchase what you purchase. We have to make sure that as we're working with the stuff, what are we producing that people are going to want to share? We want to make them want to share. As we go through and begin to put items together, what happens when we go through and we start looking at products? What happens when people use the same product?
Then they get really popular.
They like it, they recommend it to people they know.
And then the more they recommend, the more people like and listen to it. And if they like it, the more that spreads. And they'll be like, oh, I don't, that would look too.
Right, so who do we tend to associate with?
People who like and know.
People that we like and know, but how do we get to meet people that we like and know? Same interests. So when we get into the same interests, we're talking usually about same products. So if you have people who like gaming, and you're going to get together somewhere and you're going to be dealing with game stuff. If you like people that like certain music and you're going out to a club, you're going to be at the club with those same people. So what we're dealing when we start dealing with advertising is we're going through, we're ultimately going in, we're going to begin to build brand communities. So these are all people that are going to want to be at this. The other thing that's going to happen as we start to build those communities is that you're going to be looking for a certain thing. So if you're involved in a certain group and there's certain new product going to be coming out, the moment that that product, you know, anything pops up on it, boom, we're going to be sharing it with everybody. So as we start to get into advertising, we're pushing into those communities. We're developing communities. The other thing we also have is we start to look at the information. Where do we get our data from? Well, there's a lot of different places we can pull that data. So we can start looking at sales stuff. We're at the time now with data mining, where we can pull out all different things. At what time you jump on an app anymore. Like for me, I can jump on an app and I can see what time's the gym the busiest. All right, I'm going to avoid it at 11:28 because 11:28, it's almost at max capacity. I don't want to be there then. So we start to look at what's available to us data-wise. There's tons of data. Every time someone goes through and scans UPC code at the store, it goes into their system, and of course it kicks itself back out to many different companies because that's where the big money is right now, is in the whole data sharing and selling the data. So as we get into that, where are we getting this information from? What can we do with that? How can we see what's happening with it? You know, where are people using it the most? Let's look at software. Is it being purchased for smartphones, tablets, desktops? Where can we go through and continue to push these experiences out to it? And then the other thing is starting to look at social campaigning. So when we go through and start to look at where's going on, what are we promising our group, and where is that occurring at? So as we go through and we start to think about it, again, it is a specific message. So it goes back to the whole narrative part of it. What is the story that you're trying to tell, and how does this piece that you're creating add on to the story that's already been building within the organization? So what is effective advertising? And well, as we talked about, these are all the things we just went through and we're looking at. So when we start thinking about all these, keep all of these in mind, understand what is it that you want to be doing with it. So when we get into actually creating advertising, starting to think about what it is that we're going to be going in and doing, we have to go back and look at these 3 steps. The same thing we get into when we're really designing anything is, number 1, we have to create some sort of visual interest to attract the people. If the people don't see our product, they don't see our design, then the advertisement isn't able to do anything. There's no communication that takes place. It's the same thing if we go and if something's put up and it's in a language you don't understand. It doesn't matter how neat the poster looks, how cool everything is on it, the colors that are chosen, the image that's there. If you don't understand what it's saying, no communication can take place, and it's the same thing as looking at a blank sheet of paper. So what are we going to do to create that visual interest to attract people into it? Now once we go through and we actually attract them in, we need to then be able to communicate that clear, relevant message. Clear, and that's understood. Relevant, that the person that's actually viewing it and interacting with it is going to get something out of it. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, in advertising, there's so many like companies that like, cause I've seen companies and stuff like that will take a trend from like 5 years ago or longer, like from however long ago 2016 was, and then apply it to like 2022, and just it feels so incorrect and wrong and weird.
And
Did you see the people who still use dabs and the floss and stuff like unironically in
Yeah.
advertisements?
so what they're really looking at a lot of times when you get into stuff, when you start pulling stuff out, is it's the nostalgic part. It's getting people to essentially reconnect with a part of their previous life, and it's an emotional appeal is what it is.
And there's also the advertisement of like, oh, we want to connect with this certain audience.
Right, it's audience based, but and that's where I say a lot of times if you see something that gets resurrected that's kind of faded off, it's to go back and essentially, to me, it would be an emotional appeal to people to think about what their life was 5 years ago. I mean, most people, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of people pushing back, to 2020, 2021 and trying to,
Who doesn't even who wants to go back to 2020?
Right. So it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen as we move forward as to what happens with some of it. But again, as we do that, we're talking about our clear, relevant messages, and that's understandable what it is, and then who exactly we're going towards. And then the other thing is it's motivate people. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. The reason why we get advertisements out there is we want people to, mainly the things that we see the most of, we want people to go buy something. Buy a ticket to a movie, buy a new car, buy this certain candy bar, buy these shoes, buy these clothes, go to these stores. I mean, those are all the things that we go through and we start to push forward. So we're motivating people to do something. Schedule yourself to donate blood. So as you start to think about what's there, look at the messages, become more aware as you're looking at advertisements. What exactly are they saying? What are they trying to communicate? What's the product? And we get into the product, it's the people they choose to put in there, it's the objects that are also inside of that advertisement. A lot of times people go in and they start to look at them, and the real focus for them is just the product itself. Well, it's not just the product, it's everything that's a part of it. I mean, there's a reason why, when we start looking at stuff that's, people look a certain way inside the ads. That's because that's who they're targeting. What are the colors in there? What are the, objects, vehicles, homes, furniture, all this stuff that exists inside the advertisement is there for a reason. So what are some of the different types of ads that we go in and we start to look at? Well, first off is commercial advertising. So we're going in and we're actually promoting brands. We might be promoting individuals. So we start talking about political candidates. As much as I loathe politics, especially when it comes time for elections, because again, as they go through and do that, they're trying to push a specific message. And any time that we're trying to push a specific message, we focus on just the things that we want known. So as we go through and start to look at that, what are they choosing to put into that? Again, looking back at the message and the relevance. Who's it going towards? How relevant is that to you? And then also, just like anything, looking at everything that's being presented. We start looking at entities. So in this, we're looking at anything. So we start looking at corporations. We start looking at different boards. We start looking at organizations. So all these going in here to start to push a specific entity. So what are they trying to get you to do? We get into commercial advertisement. So when we get into that, a lot of times what we get into are either single designs or we get into an actual campaign. So as we start to break them down, what are we really looking at? Well, we have consumer ads first off. So these are pushed towards the general public. So we just want you to go and actually purchase something. Business to business or B2B, those ads then are aimed at one company to another. So in this case, you're working with stuff, you're dealing with packaging, and you have different companies that are trying to get you to purchase from them. So you're buying possible stock from them to use in your packaging company. If you're going in and you're starting to work with paper and cutting paper to certain sizes that you're using a specific company, ordering the paper from them, bringing it in there and then slicing it down. If we're looking at tires, again, your tire store, who is it that's you're buying from? Goodyear, Bridgestone, Firestone, Toyos, Pirelli. So with that, you're really pushing those in. And then the last one gets into our trade ads, which are geared towards a specific group. So we start getting into what's happening with those. We want you to buying specifically, like I said, if it's start getting into trades, products. Again, it gets down, even digs in deeper to a specific subgroup inside of what we'd have when we start looking at business to business. Now, another thing that we go in and we start to work with are PSAs. So,
This is public service, you know.
yes, public service announcements. So it gives us an opportunity to go in and benefit someone. So with that, it's all public interest.
You hear that tactile engineer music every time you play PSA.
Or you hear Sarah McLachlan going in there, for PETA and that.
Oh God. They're horrible.
Right, and that with hers, or is this hers Humane Society. I lose track.
Yeah.
It might be Humane Society. That's Humane Society, I think, is Sarah McLachlan's.
Humane Society is fine. People is horrible.
What,
They're
people
horrible
eating tasty animals? Is that what it's for?
No. They did something on Twitter. I've seen videos on it. I don't have Twitter anymore.
Crazy shit. They like, there was a time where they like defaced someone's car. They
Just because
Well-
they
harass people.
just because they hate.
There are, you have to, you kind of have to be careful as you get out there, there are those that are the extremes on everything.
That's what the dog breed is for.
So it's tough.
Dogs.
it's tough to go through and start to work with that because, like I said, it's different experiences. So what are your experiences with it? You know, you look at historical context. So there's a lot of things that go into organizations, and then you have people, like I said, that are the extremists from anything, and they go way beyond what they should do.
Yeah.
But when we get into public service announcements, this is all about public interest. This is really set to go through and serve the society. So don't sit down and think that you know, PSAs are anything other than that. It's society. A lot of times we get into PSAs and you'll see PSAs that are posted in there. There's slots that are set aside on TV specifically for them, and even a lot of times the pay structure that goes into what you're paying for that advertisement space is different for a public service announcement. They're all about education and awareness. So when we go through and start to look at them, they want to make you aware of something. They want to educate you on some sort of significant issue that's going on that's in the benefit of the public. So the goal here is to get you to change what your attitudes and behaviors are, and also try to get you to get on board and stimulate you to go through and make a change. Now, what is that change? Again, it depends on the organization, depends on what it is that they're trying to go after with it. The challenge when we get into public service announcements is making sure that the choice that they're asking you to make is a positive change. And that's when we get into what are they asking you, positive versus negative, sometimes, especially in a public service setup, is often debatable. Because we're asking you to do something, you know, is it positive to go in and necessarily get a dog from a shelter versus getting a dog from a breeder? Well, we can hash that out all day long. Yes, ma'am.
Also, for public service and advertising, it's a very specific thing. Like, not only do you have to make sure that you're getting the right audience, you also make sure you're being mature.
Well, I
They're
think
not mature.
well, when you get at that, it's again the challenge that we have with a lot of advertising is it goes back again to clear, relevant message. You're delivering a clear, relevant message. Who it relates to, or who it's relevant to, is specific. So as you go through to choose it, we can argue about maturity of things. We can argue about you know, even we can get into the fact of how truthful is an advertisement at times when we go through and we start getting in and splitting hairs with that. When we get into working with, like I said, the public service announcements, the other thing that we go through and we have with it is that we're really going in to typically work with nonprofits. It's the most common thing you see when you get a public service announcement is it focuses on to a nonprofit organization. A lot of times these nonprofits do also lead back to other organizations, but with it, what we'll start to see in there is that there isn't any direct commercial affiliation when we get into public service announcements. Now, are there indirect stuff? Yeah, it's like anything. You follow the money, you're going to find some other people that are supporting what's going on with that. So as we start to push, you know, something that's dealing with agricultural and pushing, you know, an ag and farm focus, ultimately with that, they're not directly related to any specific thing, but a lot of times you're going to find donations going into it. When you start getting into the farm things, yes, John Deere, International Holland, you know, these big corporations, Case is part of Case IH. So as that stuff all goes, we start to push. You can find that there are people that are donating funds in there to assist these organizations that ultimately have a better impact on the larger group. But with that, we talk about no commercial affiliations, no direct thing where you're going to see those individual companies listed inside of the advertisement. So if we break down our PSA categories, where exactly do we end up? Well, the most common areas that we start to have education. So you'll see stuff, you know, pushing towards literacy. Again, they're not going back to a direct commercial affiliation with that, but pushing you to start reading and start to deal when we start looking at minority, diversity in education. So it's a larger group that we start to see with that. Family and community. So again, hungers, pet shelters, things along those lines will fall into our family and community. We have health. So this is when we make people aware of something. And
If you had mesothelioma.
Well,
Those commercials.
the mesothelioma, yeah. So there's things along those lines that get into that, and what exactly is it talking about? What area is it going towards? Those get to be a little bit questionable depending on, is it a specific group that's pushing in there? And a lot of the things when we start looking at mesothelioma ends up being the factor of somebody saying, "Hell, we'll sue and get you $67 billion."
Call the IRS back
So-
and get your taxes now.
So when we start to look at that, what's happening with health versus safety? There's a little bit of crossover that can start to happen inside of there.
I see like every time I'm on YouTube, it's like 5 ads out of 10 is always like vape ad, like saying like you can quit. You know,
Right,
like
and
that's
the challenge that we start to get is, again, where's the line? Well, the easiest way to look at, is it public service or is it actually a commercial advertisement? Is there a specific product? I mean, that's just really what it goes back to. You know, if we're looking at, a large group of just, Farm Bureau, well, that's gonna cover a lot of different places. If we're looking at a specific area, then it's gonna be a little bit different. It's gonna kick it back out of PSA area. Safety, texting and driving is a big one that you see a lot of stuff with. Bullying, obviously, smoking, vaping, a big thing now. As you go through and start to work with it, distracted driving is probably the main one you start to see out there. Drinking and driving, sleeping when you're tired, all of those types of things that we get. So we start looking at outdoor PSAs. This is something you might see on a billboard. So with that, even texters and drivers hate texters and drivers. And that's just going in there as we start to think about stuff. People do something, you're like, well, get off your phone. And then 5 minutes later, you're sitting there sending a text to somebody else. So as you start to think about it, that's the story that's going in there. Stop text, stop Rex. So as we go through and we start to get into advertising, another big thing comes into dealing with the copywriting. And you'll see when we get into start talking about what really goes into being an advertising designer and actually getting into advertising, is getting into that copywriting. What text are you using? What's going to get people to actually go in there and remember what it is that you are saying. So we go through and we start to think about the various channels. So what channels do we have available to us? Well, we have paid media, we have owned media, we also have then earned media channels that we can go through and work with our advertising on. So we start out about paid. This is where you simply buy space. So I want to put an ad inside of a printed magazine. So as I go through and do that, I'm paying for that. I want a quarter page. This is what's going to cost. I want a half page. This is what it costs. I want a full page. Here's the total cost on it. I want a full spread. Then that's going to be something else. So we go through and we start to look at that. Those are our paid channels. That's when you're getting into and you'll see things clear across different magazines, different genres, and everything.
Advertisements on like every website, you're gonna see like ad of random like.
So as we get to that, it's going to get into the fact. So if we think about like side ads in Google, those are all paid media. We get into the owned media. Now we're going in here and we're starting to look at what are the brand owned media sites. So in this case, we get into then now we're seeing their websites. And as we get into microsites, we're talking about those sites that link back essentially to that main site. Mobile apps, what's going on inside of there? A lot of times we start seeing them pushing out things that, of course, are related to that. And then we get into the one that really is the one that's starting to kind of take off, and a lot of people are using from it. You start thinking about influencers when you get into Instagram and everything, and that's our earned media. So that takes us into word of mouth, fan pages, news, TV, anything like that. Twitter, if you mention something on Facebook, like I said, if you're pushing Instagram, maybe you do something on Snapchat. What are other ones that are out there that I haven't mentioned? Anything? MySpace.
He's so old, dude.
What are we back in, like 1998?
Yeah.
Didn't it? And
No,
then
we
like
didn't.
2006, and then Zuckerberg's like, I'm gonna make Facebook.
I mean, Tom's still my friend.
Alright.
Isn't that what his name was? The one that was always
Yeah.
your first friend, Tom?
Wow, you
First
never
friend.
remember your
Top
friend
friend.
name, Tom.
They still have you.
You won't leave me.
With his, isn't he like he's sitting like at a desk or something, side view type setup? I don't know. The scary part about it is, you know, how many people. I wouldn't be surprised if I've got a MySpace site that's just been parked for so long out there that's got like old vintage photos and stuff on it.
Let me see. I wonder if MySpace still even. I wonder.
I'm pretty. MySpace still works. I know it still works. So we start to look at what's there. I mean, even to the push, we start talking about earn. People talking about it in songs.
Oh my God, it still works.
So when we start thinking about what's there, that's earned media means you put in the effort and then people want to go through there and start to share what it is. So as we start to build it, you know, think about different ways that you can go in and connect to it. Think about what things that you use. What are you seeing? You know, so as we go and we begin to work with it, another thing that we get into is we start getting into pull marketing. So with that, we're start to talk about grabbing an organization or working with something and bringing items together for specific results. So Alex the Kid and IBM, so we go through and we start to look at dealing with Watson Music. So with that, they chose him to come in and actually create things about how exactly do we go in and begin to work with the mood. So in that case, they're working in there to express a certain mood with it. So what happened with that though is they chose somebody who has a connection somewhere. So when we start talking about those, those connections are essentially like individual data points. And with that, we're able to, as soon as it's out there, people, just because of who it is, go in and use it. Same thing we think about even going through and they choose certain people to push a product. Why? Well, because they push it out to their 250 million followers, and all of a sudden, you know, if you get 10% to come back in and buy the product, it's 25 million sales. Looking at taking a Snapchat ad Under Armour did and creating it into an interactive video game. So what are all these things that we can go through and we can begin to use to actually pull people in? Now we get into our print ads. So what we see here is, this is DDB, so this is Doldane Bernbach. Here we start looking at dealing with the Volkswagen. So when we go through and we start to look at it, before we're done with the semester, there is a video that I plan to show, and they actually go and they start talking about, it's all with DDB, so with Doldane Bernbach, they start talking about how do they go through and they choose these things and what happens with it and how do they end up where they were at with it. So we start looking at the standpoint of there on think small. So at times we go through and we start to think about what's happening with our advertising, look at and start to think about what are the things that we can ultimately go in and grab from it. Instead of looking at something and saying, well, you know, this, like in this case, it's smaller than something else. Well, let's focus on that. Let's push that into there. So again, as we start to look at that story, we start to think about what we have for our overall story. So when we get into, when we start to think about creating advertising, and let's jump back here. So who ultimately goes in and creates our advertising? Well, when we get into it, we're really talking about an advertising agency. So that's an individual company that its sole goal is to provide creative, marketing, and other business-related services. So with that, they're going to plan, they're going to create it, they're going to produce it, and they're ultimately going to place it. So we get media buyers who go in and choose where are we going to get the best bang for our buck or return on investment by going in and taking these ads, where are we going to place them at? And once they put all these people together, that's how we go through and we ultimately create then a design. So you have this creative team that's chosen based upon, again, the actual organization, sometimes experiences with it, and we go through and we put them into a group and they begin to discuss what is there. Now, as we get into those various positions, it's not just somebody who goes in, and we don't just put a bunch of random people into a room and we kick this stuff out. We start getting into it. A normal team that we have inside of here is going to include an art director and a copywriter to begin with. So as we get these people together, the art director is going to be the one that's responsible for generating the ideas and the overall direction of it. So what is the style? What are the photographs? What are the illustrations? A lot of times that art director is going to actually choose a photographer, or may go in and choose the illustrator that they're going to use. And then typically as they begin to work, there are going to be additional designers that are on the team, and those designers will go through and start to create different designs, put things together. You see them in a room, you'll start putting a bunch of ideas up on a wall, sketching ideas out, and they will start to come into that art director, who will then go through and begin to choose what exactly is going to happen with it. Now, an area that a lot of people don't get into thinking about is that of the copywriter. So when we start thinking about the copywriter, we talk about the art director's in charge of the art direction of it, and then we have the copywriter. The copywriter's actually in charge then of all of the writing. So they'll start looking at even the ideas based upon what text is ultimately going to go in and hit that. So as we choose that, we start looking at where does this stuff ultimately come from? Well, as we get into the role of being an art director, being a creative director, the copywriter, these things all actually take their way back to Bill Bernbach, who was, like I said, with DDB, or Doyle Dane Bernbach. So he's really the one that really pushed, of course, and established these as the roles of a creative team. So we start thinking about what is it that we're choosing? Why are we choosing what we're choosing? How does this stuff start to work? This is where we really push that creative aspect of going in and really understanding what's being chosen by it. Now, as we go and we start looking at different teams that you may ultimately end up with. So as we get into choosing a team that is a conventional team versus an integrative team, like what exactly is it that we want to go in and build with it. So as we go through and we start to put our teams together, are we going through and essentially having our different groups working out on their own? Or how are we assembling the teams? Start to think about those elements. Are we choosing people together, people choosing to work together? And then understand what people have as their strengths and also what we have for weaknesses. Now, one thing that's really starting to change with this is that as we get into working with our designs, or going in and beginning to think about dealing with branding, start dealing with the different channels that are available to us, technology is continuing to shift.
Yeah.
So as we start to think about the technology, the other thing to keep in mind is that we have to decide how exactly are people going to be using it, where are they going to be seeing it, where is it going to show up. And we have to ultimately, as we design this stuff, we have to begin to think about loyalty. Where are they going to be at? Where are they working from? Where do they want to see our stuff? How do they want to interact with our product? So along with the advertising, it has to go the same route as the other elements do. So start to think about those items, start to think about what you're hearing from people, how things go through, and begin to function with one another. Also start to think about, again, what do you need to bring in? So again, technology's there. To successfully execute what it is that you're doing and working with, you need to bring those people in, integrate them into the group as we go through and use them. So as we get into designing, we get to the point where we get to a junior art director. So somebody that's going to be there that is going to begin to essentially learn the roles to work their way up to becoming an art director. So we get into that. They need to be creative thinkers, capable of idea generation. These are all things that you, once you finish up here, could ultimately go somewhere and become a junior art director with it. So begin to think about stuff creatively. Don't ever go in there and say, oh, that's a horrible idea. No. Put it down as the ideas come and start to generate those ideas. They may actually find themselves usable or functional later on as we go in to start to move things around. There'll be a certain element of that that may work for it. You need to be a critical thinker that's capable of strategic thinking. So as you start to think about the strategy that's there, how are we going to get this to work? Start thinking about visual forms. So what are ways that we go and we can create that? So we get into that, the visual thinker capable of realizing ideas in a visual form. So you come up with an idea. How are we going to create that? So we go back and we start thinking about all the other foundation. We start thinking about what are we doing with our colors? What are we doing with our strokes? How are we going to actually show that? What are our images that we're choosing? What's the typography? Remember, everything's made up of type and images. A solid understanding of design, as I just mentioned, that's what we're going back to. So we start thinking about composition. How are we laying this out? We start thinking about the typography again. Why are we choosing that typeface? Are we choosing multiple typefaces? How do they work with each other? As we start to think about how are we gaining the attention of our audience? We start thinking about line weights, margins. All of that stuff comes into play as we get back into it and start to work with it. Communication and collaboration skills, probably the most important part. As we went through and we started talking about all the people that take part in in creating an advertisement, you have to be able to communicate and collaborate with others. You're not going to do it all by yourself. So with that, what is it that you work with? How do you communicate to others? Understanding, as we get into design, that just because somebody doesn't like an idea you came up with, it doesn't mean they don't like you. It's not like you go in and you're like, oh, look at this great idea, and they go, I don't like it, oh, that's not going to work. Just throw it in the garbage can and go back to your office.
Yeah, go back to square.
I mean, it doesn't mean anything. It's not a personal thing. It's focused back on, does it communicate the story, the narrative that we're trying to define for the company. Understanding the capabilities of media channels. Get exposure into what the different channels are available media-wise.
Yeah, like for like YouTube, it's like, oh, if a bigger YouTuber shouts you out, and then you end up getting more subs.
Right. So, but we're looking at that. So, what's capable based upon these? And capabilities are the technical capabilities, the social capabilities, the emotional capabilities. All of these things are there. So, as we start to look at the channels, too often people think of them strictly based upon, oh, it's an app. Oh, it's a commercial. Oh, it's a print ad. Yeah, that's where it's at. But what are the added capabilities of it? What can we do on certain things and what can't we do? From a printing standpoint, what are the additional things we can do that are available in printing? Are we going in and printing things that are lenticular so that as it moves it, you see the colors and object moving? Can we print something, holographic? Can we go through and as we choose our colors, what's happening with the color on there? Tricks to go through if we want to use a matte paper and want certain things to be glossy, then we go through and we put a varnish over it. So as we go through and start to think about that, understanding what is available to us channel-wise. In-depth knowledge of, as they list, Adobe products really is what they're up here. But really what we start talking about it from a standpoint of in-depth knowledge of all of the tools that are available. Now, all maybe isn't the right word, but in-depth knowledge of various tools that are out there. There are certain tools from the Adobe suite that are obviously more expensive. But if we want to go through and we're not going to deal with writing HTML5 and aren't using Dreamweaver because we don't have that, what are the things that are out there? There's an app out there called Hype. That's all an HTML5 editor, which allows you to do animations and everything. It's very similar to Director. So as we start to look at that, what's there? Photoshop, it's GIMP that's available. So if you can't afford to go through and work with, that type of software, we're looking at open source software. You can find open source software out there for a lot of these different products. So while yes, Adobe would be our industry standard, if you can't afford it because you're just starting out and you don't want to be paying that subscription, there are other applications out there.
Yeah.
Now the number of open source software applications changes every single day. So as you start to look at what is it that's available for you to use, you'll just have to kind of do a search, go find open source based upon the machine you're working on, whether it's Windows-based or Mac-based. And then with that, also start to look at code. And that's the thing, anytime anybody talks to me at all about graphic design, the one thing I always tell people is also pick up a little bit of programming. So whether it's, here, like a computer science 1, they keep changing the numbers on me, so it's hard for me to keep up with them. There was a 132, I think I don't think 132 is offered anymore, it's like 135. But basic programming, understand what goes into there, it doesn't matter language. If you want to learn it on your own, the thing I talk about in code is go and learn Python. Python's very easy to learn. The goal of anything though is to use it. So,
Is Lua also a rather easy one to learn?
I don't know.
Lua's easy as well.
What?
Lua.
Lua?
Yeah.
It was like writing English. It's a very basic language. Not
Okay.
much to it. It's if, then, for, and that's about all the key operators.
Okay. So it's one of those things where, like I said, understanding that, and that's just because as designers now, if you're working out in industry, you're working in something that's going to use a programming language at some point. So if you know how to use it, it's great. I've actually had designers who've gone out, worked as designers, and then became programmers because they were doing all of the front end work anyways, and they were learning the back end work as they were working. Now granted, the two of them that went also where I came from, they essentially almost had a computer science minor because they required so much programming as well in our general education. So they had that benefit as well, but they knew how to do it, so they were doing all this front end work. And then when the stuff wasn't working because the back end, they were having issues, so they were doing a lot of their own coding, that it became a point that when they hired the coding, they just went ahead and took the coding jobs. And then if they needed something to finish up what they were working on, they just created their own graphics and then fed them right into their own applications. So it's good to know what's happening with the code. If not for you to code, it goes back to the whole communication collaboration. If you can sit down with the person who's working on your mobile app and say, well, no, this is what I want it to do. If we do this and we do this, then I want it to do that. If we don't do that, then I want it to do this. So we start talking about the interactivity that's going to happen with that. But the other thing that happens when we get into code is we get into prototyping technologies. So when we start talking about interface design, so if you're taking user interface with me in the fall, we use mainly XD to go through and start to build the interface. Where are the things at? What happens when we click on stuff? Where does it go? The nice thing about that is it's not us programming based to where we're not going in and having it reload certain things. We're doing it strictly from looking at it from a graphic standpoint. So what available technologies are out there for you to prototype and at least allow you to be able to show your client, this is what we can do with it. This is what it's going to look like. So what happens? Well, we get into our idea generation. So as we go in to figure this out, we need to start to think about what is it that we are going to be doing. What is the concept of it? Why are we doing what we're doing? That's that underlying story. So when we start talking about it, people will come up with a great concept. Some people come up with really good concepts and they have real poor execution. So that's where, as we start to work into it, it's great to come up with a great idea, a wonderful concept that's going to go through and function. And this is what's underneath of it. We're not to the strategy yet, but this is the underneath of it. And then as we take that idea, along with that idea, it becomes a strategy as to how are we ultimately going to go ahead and deliver this. So we get into the mapping part of it. So what we're doing with this is as we work with these items, we're mapping whatever that we have here back to whatever we've gotten in our information via research. So when we jump back and we start to think about that creative brief, that written document that we put together that's outlining and strategizing our design, or in this case, an advertising project. So as we start to look at that, this is going to go through, and that creative brief states the project strategy, and then as we start to work with that idea plays off of that narrative to bring us back into what is here. So as we start to build the items, as we start to work with them, We need to begin to understand what's happening with it. So as we start to get into those creative briefs, first thing we can start to look at is we start looking at what is our position in the marketplace. Where are we at? And then we balance that against that competition. You know, does anybody ever talk about them being number 2? Yes, there is though. So with that, you know, they start talking about the fact of being number 2, we work harder. Wasn't it Avis? I'm taking things out here. Avis talks about we're number 2, so we work harder. Not claiming to be number 1. They realize that they're not the number 1 rental company, but they work harder because they're working to become number 1. Person who's number 1 just sitting there, oh, we're good. Everybody use our
Sitting
product.
there just counting the cash.
So in that case, they're using their marketplace position as a way to go through and start to say, this is why you should choose us. So start to think about that. What's going to happen with it? How are we going through and starting to look at who is our target audience? And what do we want to end up doing with that? So a challenge, in that case, they're challenging us to start to think differently with it. Using something as what most people would say is a deficiency as their strength. Yes?
Yeah, so for like an example of one, I listened to this band who has made like a concept album about like horror films and all that, and then they're like, and they didn't like make that until like 2018, and they've been in their career for like almost 20 years at that point, and then when they made it, they ended up getting like really popular and all that since they connected to that scene of like film and all that. It was like really popular.
What's the band name?
Ice Nine Kills.
Yeah, so as you go through and you start to work with things, you know, understanding where your product or your company is at is important. Understanding that goes right along with who the target audience is. So what is the demographics that you're going to be working with? And the other thing is what are you trying to do? You're not just creating an ad for nothing. There's the narrative to there. What is the challenge that you have on there? We need to increase this, or we need to go through and decrease, you know, this stigma. So what exactly is happening as we go through to put that in there? The other thing is we start to look at is the connection. What do people actually think about the brand? So as we go through and we start looking at the analysis that starts to happen, as we start to push that out there, what exactly are people believing? So, you know, do they like it? Do they not like it? Are people emotionally attached to it? We get into dealing with the insight. So as we get into here, what is the specific understanding of the brand? It's not only yours, but also when we start looking at the public, as we start to dig into who you're actually trying to target with it. What do they know about it? How do we then ultimately, with that insight, how do we ultimately then begin our conversation with our target audience? And then once we begin that, we get into the point of then really looking at where are they spending their time. So when we go through, we start looking at analytics. There's a big spot we can get into. We pull that from web pages. How much time do people spend on the page? How long are they on each individual page? Where are they moving to? Where do they start at? We can go through and we can start to run, you know, things on pages. So as we start to put things together, and with it, it'll track where you're at. And it's interesting when you go through and you start to look at where do people move on pages. If you go through, you can do eye trackers and things like that, and put it on there, and it'll draw lines that you can go in and you don't see them when they're sitting there working with it, but it's tracked the eye, so then when you go through, you get the overlay, and you can put on there and see, okay, based upon the demographic, based upon age, based upon gender, where are they looking first? Where does the eye go to? So we start looking at eye tracking, we start looking at mouse movements. There's a lot of things that we can go through and we can start to pull from, again, it's data. We're sitting here, we're mining this data out, we're getting people to interact with the stuff. So there's a lot of different ways we can go about gaining the information that we want to have with everything. Now, as we continue to build into our items, we start to work with our various things. We have to start to think about how exactly are we going through to begin to get people to interact with it. So ultimately, when we go through and we start looking at stuff, anytime we get into advertising, we get into any products, what do we think about? If I ask you to do something, I want you to, go to the mall. What do you want to know? Why, right? What's in it for you? Why should I do something? So as you start to think about that, what is it you're trying to actually go through and communicate with them? And that's, as we start to look at those things, we're looking at usually functional benefits and also emotional benefits. So as we go through and we begin to work, start to think about it. You put together an idea. Why would people care about it? You need to be able to answer that question. Would people engage with it? Well, it depends on what it is. We all know that when COVID hit, that what happened to things that people had to touch regularly? They're gone. They're no longer an item there. People didn't want to touch things. So you have to start to look at what's happening with that. So are people going to engage with it? Well, if they have to go through and actually have physical contact with something, that got pushed away, closed a lot of stuff down. How does it achieve its goals? So as we go through and start to put it together, how is it fulfilling the goals that you have set there? Does it fit with the brand? So you have your organization. Does it work with that? And then is it interesting? I mean, none of us want to go through and work with anything that we're not interested in. We choose things, the music we listen to. If I go through and I choose my own music, it's not one of those things where you're going to sit there and start to think about the standpoint of, okay, I'm not interested in this, so I'm still going to do it. You're not going to listen to music you're not interested in. You're not going to watch shows that you're not interested in. So as you go through and you start to think about stuff, figure out are you actually able to be interesting in it. Like I said, that goes back to what's in it for me. We all choose stuff because maybe it's going to make us healthier. Maybe it's going to make us smarter. Maybe it's going to make us, faster. So we start looking at it. Is it a functional benefit? So in this case, it actually goes through and it gives you something essentially, if we look at it from a usefulness to this. So we start looking at items. So maybe you're talking about a soap and they push, of course, it's moisturizing. It's not going to dry out your skin. Maybe we go through and we start looking at companies, credit card, automatically protect against identity theft. Anytime you make a purchase, we're going to notify you that this has happened. So we're really looking at something that actually helps distinguish itself from whatever its competition is. So you start to think about what's there. And then we have the emotional benefit. So this is intangible. So we aren't able to go in and just say, well, your skin's going to feel softer and things like that. So we're really trying to go through and start to push you in there to make you feel better about doing something. So what happens with that? Hair color. So you want to go ahead and change your hair color. You do that. It of course drives, again, an emotional sense with it. So as we start to look at what's happening with items, we can get products. There are certain products out there that we'll talk about going through and have a functional benefit and also an emotional benefit. Yes, it's going to help you by doing this. It's going to make you feel better because of that. So don't think that we can't go through and actually work with both of them. As we go and we start to generate the ideas, the key thing when we start to generate ideas is whoever it is that you're talking to, that's your audience. Make sure that you're listening to them as well. Looking at what's happening with stuff. When they review something, what's there? If it's not a 5-star review, why not? What is it that they feel is missing from them? There's going to be somebody that's going to be like, well, it should be like this. And you're going, well, that's just not going to happen. So with that, you're not listening to everybody in the sense of, you are listening to them, but of course there's the practical and there's the impractical. Yeah. So as we go through to choose it, listen carefully to what they're saying about it. How do you change the things? If there's a bad thing that you see recurring, how do you go about changing that? Look at their behaviors. How are they using it? How aren't they using it? And sometimes how aren't they using it is just important as how are they using it. So we start looking at people. Are they buying tickets when they're outside of the train station versus are they buying stuff from home? So where's the purchase occurring for this? So we start to look at how far out. That can play into a lot of things. Be empathetic. So with that, be able to put yourself in the actual place of your audience. So Essentially, you will be them. Understand their frustrations. Sometimes even if you're like, well, I don't see what the issue is, you put yourself exactly in their shoes. I'm going to go there, I'm going to try to use it in this location. Oh gosh, can't do that. I can't buy train tickets in the train station because the train station doesn't allow me access to get on the stuff. That would be a problem. Extend beyond convention. So with this, be open about everything. So with that, try to go through and throw out any preconceived notions that you have with it and be open about the ideas. When people throw new ideas at you, when you start thinking about new technologies, they throw new technologies at you. Be open as to what's going on with those. And then observe mindfully. So when we go through and we start to see stuff, actually be allowing yourself to ultimately be involved in it. Understand what's happening with that. What can you deduct from that? So with that, really go through and think about what all is there. Now as we go through and we start to think about it, we're also thinking about what's in it for your audience. So we start thinking about the audience. Go from their point of view. That's the empathic part of it. They're going to look at it and they're going to say, what's in it for me? So if we go through and we start to think about that, we're going to start to think about what is it that they're looking at it for what? Then be informed or educated about something. Be more aware of something else. Sometimes it's all about promoting social good. And then sometimes we actually are just putting stuff out there to entertain people. It's not going to get anything that's going to happen with it, but really it's just there to entertain you, make you understand that it ultimately does exist. When we get into storytelling, remember we talked about the fact that as we start to work with things, we're talking about storytelling and story building. So when we get in here to look at the aspects of the story building, is that we're trying to go in and create this core brand narrative. It's there. People see it, they relate to it, they know it's going back to quality. Maybe it's dealing back with price. Maybe we're looking at quantity, but we're really going in and building what is there. And each time that we go through and we create something new for that company, what we're doing is we're creating an individual story. But that individual story, when we put it together with the rest of them, has to continue to build up that brand narrative. So as we build those, we're not only building it as a print ad, it's when we go from the print ad to the digital ad, how does that build on it? If we go from the digital ad and we get into a little mini game, how does that add on to it? If we're dealing with a mobile app, how does that work with it? So all these pieces, as we build them in, continue to build that structure and actually reinforce the structure of the brand narrative that we've gone through and put in there. We go through, we start to look at it, have those conversations, get original content. So where we go and we start, hiring certain groups to create that original content for the brand. Make sure that we're going through and we're having those conversations with our consumers. And then start to think about what do you have available as your own platforms. Once we get somebody involved in it, start thinking like Disney. Once you get into Disney, everything builds off of what's there with the park. How much can you control with them inside of there?
And how much can Disney buy out anything?
Well, they have a couple dollars in their bank.
Yeah, they bought what was it, they bought 20th Century Fox for over, I think it was over 500, I think the number. It's somewhere in the billions.
I didn't see that one. But other things we start to look at is going in here and looking at what's starting to happen with different pieces. What do we see when we start to look at this up here? So it's another Volkswagen. And we see that it says small but tough. And that says Polo. What we have inside of here is who's in there and behind the actual car. Officers. So in this case, what's happening with it is they've pulled up on a situation, and instead of staying behind their own police car, they've proceeded to go over and get behind the Volkswagen. Now, when people think of Volkswagen, what's the first thing you think of?
Well, Volkswagen usually known to become more reliable car.
But what really put Volkswagen on the map? The Beetle. What is the Beetle? Is it a giant car? No, it's small.
Kind of smart.
It's small. So in this case, what's happening here is they've chosen to place themselves behind a small vehicle. So it's almost along those lines of small but mighty. So as you start to think about what's going into here, how do we go about working on it? What's happening? Well, it's grabbing your attention. You'll probably look at this going, well, why are all of the police hidden behind this little tiny Volkswagen car? So we're interested in it. We start to look at it to understand what's here. So as we go through and we start to build on these items, we can start to look at what's happening with our designs. How are they put together? So when we start to put together what do we see and what do we read, we start to get into the whole fact of synergy. So as we start to work with the image and copy that's here, how are we visualizing it? How are we designing the items that are here? How do they work off of one another? So what's happening with them? And really when we start to look at that, we get the underscore part of it. How are they working cooperatively to actually allow us to have a greater effect with them than we get when we start dealing with just each individual piece that is there. So when we start getting into items, we have the idea of image copy relationship. Now we talk about image is what we're seeing, copy is ultimately what we're reading. So how do they go through and work with each other to play with it? Now we have things that are going to be driven by image. We're going to have things that are driven by copy. Now as we go through and start to think about that, what happens with that? When we start talking about which one drives it, really which one does the heavy lifting, which one does the most communication to us, in which the primary portion of the message is delivered via that method. So if it's delivered primarily via a headline, then it's going to be copy driven. If it's driven and held by, of course, what we have from the image, then it's image driven. So in this case, we start to look at this. Are there images on this? Yes. But when we go through and start to look at what's driving it, it's the text that's there. We're going to begin to read the individual text. So in this case, this is copy driven. So we've emphasized the copy, we've de-emphasized the images. The images are there in a lot of ways to provide us with texture and also provide us with a little bit of depth. And then as I mentioned, this one here is of course image driven. So it does go back and focus on the image itself. Well, yes, we eventually will go down and read it. The goal here is that everybody's hiding behind that car because they've deemed that car to be the strongest out of everything that is there.
We need cover. What's hiding behind that small Volkswagen?
Right. Well, and that's what starts to happen with stuff. But that's what it's actually communicating to you and starting to tell you that this thing might be small, but it's mighty. So as you go through and you start to see that and you start to work with that, that's what is there. Now once we move through, we get into our advertising campaign. When we start talking about a campaign, this is all about going in and coordinating everything to work together. So we're coordinating our ads, we're starting to look at each item. Well, yes, in specific channel you place it, it's going to go through and allow itself to do what it is that you want it to do. It also then has to relate back to the other items. So as we go through and we build it, it's a single ad coming off of that same idea. But with that, it goes back to the overall strategy, and it also relates to the ideas that were there. You're connecting them in some way. So we start looking at the look of it, the feel of it. We can go through and we can start to look at styling. We can look at the text that's there. We can look at an individual tagline. So there's a lot of different things that we can go through and work with it. But each one has to stand on its own. But at the same time, we go back and we start talking about that story building. It's a piece to the story. It's a piece to the puzzle that allows us to actually build up to what we have as that final image. We get into our integrated media campaign. This is when we start really pushing it across all of the various channels that we have available to us. So again, we might be dealing with print, we might be dealing with broadcast, we might be dealing with some other screen-based stuff. We might be dealing with things that are out of home, so outdoor public signage that's available to us. And then other things that we can start to work with. When the whole thing happened with COVID, where did we start to see a lot more designs showing up at? On the floors. They started putting stuff in there about maintaining spacing and don't do this and don't do that and don't
Take
stand
your shots.
here. And so everything started to go that way. Well, yes, we have locations that have regularly used things on the floor. We started to see a lot more stuff come through with that. So we started to think about what else can we do with it? Where can we find other media? Back seats of airplanes. You know, we started looking from a standpoint of that. There's other spaces inside of these buildings now that we're using to push things out. We can deal with projections. So really start to think about all the things that can go into it, and that's where I talk about exposing yourself to things that are available. Start to look at stuff, documenting different things that are available to you. Ultimately, when we start looking at a campaign, our goal with our campaign is to actually gain your attention over time. Well, yes, it'd be great if the first time that you see something, an ad, you're like, well, I got to run out and buy that. I just saw an ad for a Ferrari. I'm just going to go buy one today because, you know, why not? But our goal here is that actually you're going to see that and you're like, wow, I never knew that. All right, well, whatever. And then all of a sudden something shows up on a commercial. You know, you're watching your TV and a commercial pops up. You're like, oh, there's that again. Oh, that's interesting. And then you might see something pop up on your phone. So really as we go to push it is every time you see this, we want you to become more and more interested in it to the point that then when you go to a store, it's not like a conscious decision that, oh, I'm going to buy that. You think about it and then boom, you go in and ultimately pick that up. Now as we go through and we begin to work with our designs, how do we want them to actually look? And there's a lot of different ways we can go through and look at this. So as we get into work with them, we have those that are triplets. In this case, we're going to go through and we're going to build something, and we're really pushing things to look identical. I mean, that's as simple as it is. There's 3 different ads. They're going to be in there, but they're going to look identical. And by identical, I mean you're placing your text in the same locations. You may have a slight variation in colors, but really it's going to be very, very close to what is there. We get into cousins. In this case, we're going in there. We want you to see them and know that they're related in some way or another. However, with these, we have a much greater degree of variation inside of the composition. We may see a big change in color palette. We may see a whole different way in which we're functioning with the visualization of it. So as we start to think about it, you're going to look at them, you're going to know that it's coming from the same company. But there's going to be enough variance in it that they're not going to look exactly the same. So when we go through and we start to look at it, triplets we want you to see specifically, that's together, and it's 100% without a doubt, you know, you're going to be able to see that they're that way. With the cousins, the goal that we have there is we're using the variety to continue to draw you back into it. So as you go in and you start to think about items, we start to work with our designs. It's important that we really think about what is available to us. We get into, like I said, what the purpose of advertising is. Understand that. Start to understand more about the roles of who's ultimately creating advertising. Start to understand the process, and really the big thing is going into and starting to think about what's available to us, what sources can we work with, and become more familiar with the various media channels that are out there in which you can actually create content for. Learn what you can about them. The more information that you have, the more skills that you have as you get out of here and start working inside of advertising, the more flexible you're going to be with an organization, the more valuable you're going to be to somebody.